Chapter 24. Practice. We ate without ceremony, which is a ceremony. No one said the word protocol. No one said rescind. We talked about a film none of us had seen, and decided we liked it in theory. We guessed how Mrs. Carr keeps the geranium alive despite evidence. We discussed the harbor's gull politics, as if we'd been asked for comment by a dignified paper. When the last plate was cleaned, the kitchen returned to being a room that had never tried to hold a trial. The phone vibrated on the dresser with the manners of official mail trying not to be official. An email from county, wording negotiated by human fingers rather than a machine. The intake form correction had been added to the record. The rescind now carried my sentence on its back in the right file. Future access, if ever, would be, with accompaniment of your choosing, a phrase that tried not to sound like a threat and almost succeeded. They signed with a name we didn't recognize and a job title that apologized for knowing us. I closed the email and left it be true without help. After, the town loaned us a dry hour. We took it like people who've learned how to accept mercy without making speeches. Down at the pier, we'd held together because Wood sometimes likes to cooperate. A boy practiced throwing a line and discovered he preferred catching. The wind behaved as if it had agreed a truce with hair. We stood at the rail because the sea does not care about names, and that could be a relief or an insult depending on the day. Today it was relief. On the way back, we detoured to the school. Lights were still on in the corridor, where the head meant to keep the poem for a term. The photocopied sheet in its plastic sleeve stood taller than reproach. Beneath the title, a new small sign had appeared, printed by someone who likes fonts more than is strictly necessary. We take turns at being strong. Thank you to the writers who reminded us. Miss Sanderson's comment, in her handwriting, had a fresh ink twin at the bottom. Good work. Still arguing about the line break. She'd sign it with a smiley face that startled me with competence. Does that count as immortality? I asked. It counts as practice, Diya said, which is better. We checked the fuse box at the conservatory, because habits don't retire on their own. Hewer's sentence was still taped inside, curling polite. No further action. A corner had lifted. Rachel pressed it back with her thumb. We didn't replace the tape. Let paper learn to live with air. Bernard was at a harbor cafe with the posture of a man timing himself against nothing more than tea. He waved us in and lifted his cup and made room for our elbows. He had no envelopes. He rarely has now. He told us the weather had developed a sense of humor and would try it out around midnight. He told Diya that Mrs. Winstanley had a tin behind the counter with our names on it, and no one had dared open it. He told me without telling me that the station would like a copy of my letter for its file and would understand that the answer was no. I said I would bring a copy, and he nodded as if I had volunteered to feed a neighbor's cat. When he left, he touched the red bell with a knuckle, because he always remembers where we keep ours. At Practicalities. The shop had already decided to close, but let us in because there are exceptions stitched into the fabric of this town. Mrs. Winstanley produced a tin with our names and opened it as if the oxygen in the room had requested the favor. Inside, a neatly folded cloth, a small brass hook that had once belonged to a cloakroom, and a card in her school careful hand. For when people forget where the bell lives. She tucked it all back and gave us the hook anyway. Keep a spare, she said. Spare is another word for mercy. Night put its shoulder to the door, and the door agreed. Back home the wall had grown modestly crowded. The bench photograph, the rubbing of the rust ring, the poem, the registrar's extract tucked into a corner like a ticket you don't want to lose. None of it shouted. All of it remembered. Rachel sat on the floor by the dresser and leaned her back to it the way you lean to a sure thing it's still a thing. Diya stood at the sink and looked into the dark glass and let her face be simply a face. I opened a notebook and wrote about the hook and about the small theology of spares and about how the wheel had become its own congregation and no longer demanded ours. The answer phone blinked, the color of municipal concern. A message from the library. The anthology had gone missing briefly and then reappeared because a child had put it in the wrong place on purpose. which is how some children make sure a thing gets attention. The librarian congratulated the child privately and did not issue a fine. She asked sotto voce whether we would mind if she made 2 extra copies and left one in the staff room. We said we would mind only if she pretended to ask next time. Later, when the house had said its comfortable names to itself, I took the red bell from its bracket and set it on the table. It looked smaller there, less soldier, more tool. I rang it once with the force you'd use to wake a person who is already half awake and put it back. The sound walked into the hall and sat down. It didn't ask to be interpreted. We let it be a note. Tomorrow, Rachel said, we should practice having a day where we don't visit any of the set pieces. No mill, I said. No conservatory, Diya said. No practicalities, Rachel added, and looked grim for show. We'll fail, I said. Probably, Diya said. But failing at ordinary is still ordinary. I slept a piece of the night and woke for the unglamorous reason of thirst. In the kitchen, the clock did its dignified clicking. Through the back door small window, the garden looked like a patient in a good ward, asleep but watched. The bell moved a fraction, air having opinions. I poured water and drank and tried not to narrate it back into purpose. The room stayed honest. I went back to bed with both names, thinking the inside thoughts names think when they're off duty. Morning brought recipes, not metaphors, actual recipes. Toast, unambitious coffee, a plan to buy tomatoes without investigating their pasts. We walked the wrong way on purpose to see which streets would forgive us. They did. A boy wheeled a bicycle as if it were a companion rather than a vehicle. He rang his bell with the minimal courtesy of a person approaching a corner. A woman corrected the spelling on a chalkboard outside a cafe with the grace of someone whose hand has earned the right. The parish office hummed with the chaos of a printer who knows its importance and intends to prove it by resisting service. The woman with the bee pen waved her pen like a compass. We left her to more significant navigations. At noon we were ambushed by kindness. A note from Miss Sanderson on our mat, written as if she had never heard of email. I will stop bringing shortbread when you begin pretending you prefer anything else. A sprig of rosemary taped to the paper like punctuation. I put the note under the glass by my mother's letter, and the room did not become a shrine. It became a surface again. In the afternoon, the weather remembered its joke and tried it. Rain performed petty rebellions against windowsills. The roof rehearsed composure. We did nothing heroic. We watched the film finally and liked the parts that expected too little of us. Diya fell asleep in the second act with the confidence of someone whose nervous system has accepted the terms. Rachel put a blanket over her, without making kindness look like a thesis. Evening settled early. I wrote in the notebook about practice, the unromantic kind that gives instruments their chance at being themselves. I wrote about rooms that learn your shape so they can leave you alone properly. I wrote about how the river, left to itself, keeps no list of names and yet remembers the curve of each bank with inexhaustible tact. Before bed, we walked once more to the bench as if to check that the town hadn't undone itself while we were busy. The initials were less like a claim and more like gratitude. The carved circle on the stone lip at the mill probably still held the rain. We didn't go look. A dog passed us and chose not to engage. We applauded his decision. Back in the kitchen, we left the red bell on its bracket and the notebook open and the light over the sink on, because the house sleeps more generously when allowed one small lamp. In the hallway mirror, a man with 2 names looked like he had stopped auditioning to be the kind that needs to explain himself. Diya stood at the doorway and said good night with the unadorned competence of a person who has given up on magic and found something better. Rachel touched the frame of the rubbing, and then my shoulder, and then the switch. We slept, which is the most radical practice we have, and asked the night for nothing it wasn't already built to provide. Chapter 25. Housekeeping. We decided to do the dull errands first, the ones that teach a day how not to ask for plot. At the station, Bernard made coffee that tasted like memory doing its best, and I handed over a clean copy of the letter I'd written. Not for the file that keeps breath on spools, I said, for the file that says a person said what they meant. He stamped receive with the neatness of a man who has spent a lifetime resisting drama. This one will live in a drawer marked letters that didn't ask permission, he said, and slid it home as if returning a book to its shelf. We walked to practicalities, because that is what days like to be made of. Mrs. Winstanley produced a paper-wrapped parcel from beneath the counter with our surname written in a careful script that assumed only one name and was not offended to learn otherwise. Inside, a cloth bag stitched with a clumsy bell in red thread. For the wall, she said, or for bread, cloth should earn its keep. She didn't ask after the dented bell at the mill. She knew better than to teach objects the wrong ideas about loyalty. At the churchyard, the stones had taken on rain and patience. My mother's name did not need me. Names on stone are already busy. I stood and said the 4 letters anyway, because air likes a job, and because gratitude is only awkward if you give it too much posture. Rachel stood back and let privacy be part of the ceremony. Diya came close enough to count as witness and no further. I laid a sprig of Miss Sanderson's rosemary on the grass where the stone had learned to be stone. Thank you, I said to the part of the world that accepts it, which is never the same part twice. The wind tried on 2 directions and decided on one. At school, the corridor had learned to hold our bad poem without flinching. A child stopped and read the last line out loud to no one. The head passed us and didn't make a speech. He only did the small nod you learn when it's your job to keep children from believing a room owes them applause. Miss Sanderson appeared with a folder she hadn't meant to bring and thrust it at me without drama. Copies of permissions, a list of parents who had asked for PDF, a note in her hand that said in case you ever need to prove you wrote something once, and then immediately stopped needing to prove it. We put the folder under my arm and let it change the day's weight. At the conservatory, the fuse box kept Hewer's sentence, like a morsel the building had learned to chew. No further action. The paper had yellowed at the edge where fingers had pressed and not been scolded for it. We left at the age, which is a kind of obedience. Back home, the wall looked less like a museum and more like a list a house keeps to remind itself to be kind. The bench photograph, the rubbing, the poem, the extract tucked in a corner, the cloth bag with a red bell shape that had already forgiven its own amateur stitches. Rachel sat on the floor with her back against the dresser and said nothing to the room, and the room said nothing back, which is the best kind of conversation. Diya opened the drawer, deliberately not a check, and put in a plastic card from the registrar with a second copy beneath it, because sometimes redundancy is mercy. She closed the drawer, and it stayed closed without theatrics. Lunch forgave us for being simple. Bread, heat, 2 apples that wanted to be better than they were, and didn't have to be. We talked about the film and decided the part with the dog had been patronizing. The dog in this town would have sent a letter if he'd wanted to explain himself. We discussed the harbor's odd season, boats sulking on their ropes as if expecting an apology from weather. We didn't say protocol. We didn't say unit. We didn't say forget. We said pass the salt. In the afternoon, the parish office rang to say the laminated spare had bubbled unhandsomely and would I like a new one. I said yes because accepting help is practice, too. The woman with the B-pen said, "Your file looks tidy," and made it sound like something a person could be proud of without shame. The librarian emailed a photograph of the corridor display with a caption that red line break resolved, for now. Bernard texted simply tea. We said yes because tea is a verb here. We met him at the Harbor Cafe. He came late enough to prove he'd been somewhere else living a life and not waiting to be useful to ours. He brought no envelopes, only a newspaper folded to the puzzle page. We need volunteers of fate, he said, and I have reached the age where I'm more effective at pointing than lifting. Diya wrote our names in the margin beside biscuits because we are realists. He looked at me for a long second, and then did the small, grave smile men like him permit themselves when weather behaves. "You've made the town simpler," he said. "I think the town made me simpler," I said. He tapped the newspaper with a single finger. "When people ask, tell them you kept both names until they learn to keep you back. It'll save time." We walked from there with the red bell making a small weight in my pocket because I had taken it down to dust a bracket and forgotten to rehang it, which is how objects put themselves in your day when your day is ready. At the mill, the carved circle had collected a shallow plate of clearer water, as if the stone had decided to hold a minute for anyone who needed one. We didn't put the bell there. We didn't need to. We stood long enough to remind the wheel of the arrangement. It does its arithmetic. We do ours. On the bench, an old man we didn't know had fallen asleep and was snoring in a key the birds tolerated. The initials read as if the wood had started to think them part of its grain. A child approached with chalk and stopped because the board was already full. His mother showed him the pavement 2 feet to the left, and he accepted the alternative as if he had invented it. Diya touched the carved line with one finger the way a person touches their own name when it is written neatly and without error. "Practice," she said, and let her hand fall. The suit appeared as a shadow in a window, then as a man outside it, then as a person walking the opposite direction, carrying the sort of brown envelope that suggests someone has learned to apologize on paper. He didn't cross to us. He lifted the envelope an inch as if acknowledging it, then lowered it and kept going. His face has become the kind you pass without needing to interpret. I prefer him that way. Evening learned the house again. I rehung the red bell with the bracket small screw and made sure wood and metal agreed. I rang it once, not as a test, only to let sound know it will be employed as needed. The note walked into the hallway and sat on a chair and behaved. I wrote in my notebook, "Housekeeping. The art of letting rooms keep what they must and carry nothing they don't." I put the notebook down without waiting to see if ink would flee. It didn't. Rachel opened a window to let the day out. Diya made tea with a discipline that would have impressed the unit if the unit had ever liked the right things. Before bed, I opened the drawer a final time because keeping drawers honest is also housekeeping. The letters lay in their row, no more dangerous than spoons. The consent wore my line like a signature that had finally chosen at hand. The bench photograph had accepted indoor light as a second truth. The plastic card looked bored, which meant it had learned its role. I closed the drawer and ran my palm once over the wood as if smoothing a sheet. In the small hour, wind came with the confidence of something that had passed an exam and wanted to show its certificate. The bell moved and made a quiet, working sound. Somewhere a doll with a white patch over one, I took his route and kept his counsel. The sea set its long vowel and the roofs, having learned their own names, didn't answer. We slept because nothing on the list required counting. Tomorrow we will forget something ordinary and remember it before lunch. We will volunteer to serve biscuits badly and laugh under a tent that leaks in one corner. We will pass the mill and not measure ourselves against it. We will let the conservatory keep its paper. We will let the town keep the part of us it has earned. We will keep the rest. That is the work. That is the keeping. Chapter 26. The Fate. The sky practiced a compromise and settled on Brightwood warnings. Rachel sorted cups by an order only she could see, and somehow everyone obeyed. Diya arranged biscuits with the severity of a curator who had sworn to protect crumbs from dictatorship. I wore an apron that had once been white and now looked like the history of sugar. The red bell stayed at home on its bracket because today was for bells that had jobs. The one on the tent pole would do. The notice board beside the tea stall had our poem in miniature, the title trimmed to fit, the last line slightly crooked because earnestness has fat fingers. Children drifted past it on their way to tombola and face paint, and the stall where a man sold improbable lemon slices that tasted mostly of timing. Miss Sanderson arrived with a box of shortbread and a verdict about the weather that persuaded the clouds to reconsider for at least an hour. She kissed Rachel's cheek and handed me a packet of napkins, as if deputizing me to keep the world from sticking to itself. Names on the volunteer sheet? The head teacher asked from the next tent, writing with a serious date stamp pen. I said both, and he wrote both and didn't ask which should be first. The paper looked pleased with itself for once. We poured tea and told people where to find change, and invented policies about whether a fallen scone counts as a tragedy. Bernard announced the raffle numbers with a voice that could make a room sit up without resenting it. The conservatory had contributed plants that want a rescue. Practicalities had donated 3 hammers and a moral about screws. The parish office offered table retired forms cut into scrap paper, every margin stamped with tiny bees. The woman with the bee pen stood behind it and watched children draw wings on the official seals. At noon, a gust took the corner of our tent and tried to teach it flight. We reached as one body. Rachel to the rope, Diya to the pole, me to the tray before physics claimed an entire tray of ecclesiastical sponge. We behaved as if we had rehearsed it in another century. The tent settled, forgiving. People clapped the way people clap, when nothing is broken, and the day has chosen mercy. The suit appeared near the bookstall carrying a child's rucksack with dinosaur teeth printed along the zip. He had a face that had learned soft weather. A girl with hair clipped up in the defiant way of the young considered the second-hand books with absolute seriousness. Selected one with a train on the cover and another with a librarian who owns a dragon, and paid in coins counted twice. He stood back while she decided. When she turned, she used his first name without honorific and demanded lemonade. He complied with the expression of a man who has lately given up on the paperwork of control. He saw us and did the exact right thing. He lifted 2 fingers in a civilian hello and kept walking. Progress. Diya said, eyes still on the biscuits. Particular, I said, and poured more tea. Rachel moved to the crowd with the triage calm that makes toddlers settle and elderly shoulders unstiffen. She checked a grazed knee and a questionable wrist and returned a woolen scarf to an owner who had begun to miss it without remembering it existed. She refused money and accepted a bag of jam tarts with a professional grace we reserve for bribes dressed as gratitude. A boy went missing for 6 minutes that felt like longer, and then the field remembered its training. Parents walked without running. Names were called in voices that told air to help instead of panic. Bernard stood on a bench and described a child as if giving a weather report. Blue jacket, left shoe with bravery issues, hair attempting independence. He was found by the tombola, content and sticky, examining numbers for their moral worth. The red bell would have been loud. The bell tied to the tent pole was enough. We rang it once, and people moved toward the sound without mistaking it for omen. At the craft table, a girl drew a wheel and gave it too many spokes. Diya leaned over and added a bell in the corner, not as a symbol. Just because the drawing needed a circle to stand on, the girl nodded, unbothered by assistance, and wrote 2 letters between them as if remembering a story she had been told and chosen to keep. No one corrected her. In the long middle of the afternoon, the kind of quiet arrived that fates defy with raffles and trumpets. We defied it with washing up. Rachel established a small city of drying racks. I held a towel with the reverence of people who have learned to admire how cloth gets on with its work. Diya told Mrs. Winstanley that the cloth bag with the red bell looked like a promise and was already earning its keep. Mrs. W. said promises are only dangerous when they're idle and handed us a spare hook she had found in a drawer she insists is not a reliquary. The head teacher approached with a cash box and a face that had been responsible for too many coins. We've just about covered the conservatory repair, he said. The rest will be spent apologizing to the piano. He hesitated, then added, would you consider reading the poem at the end? Just once. No speeches. The children expect it. The hall expects it. We considered and said yes because saying no would have been an argument with gravity. At 4, the field turned itself toward the stage. The sky kept its warning to itself. We stood at the microphone with the practiced terror of messengers. I looked at Rachel and Diya and then at a crowd who had seen us carry tables and not insist on meaning. I held the paper the head teacher had printed. The font was the good obedient kind. We read it together, not line by line this time, but as a single voice made of 3 throats. The last line landed where it should, and if some people heard it wrong, they still heard it kindly. The small bell at the tent made a polite sound when someone brushed it, and the sound fretted the silence without breaking it. After, Bernard pressed a raffle prize into my hands, not because I had won, but because he wanted to watch me accept a useless kitchen gadget with grace. The suit's child walked by with her lemonade and corrected her father's route without apology. The woman with the pen packed away stamps that had done their duty and let a child keep one by mistake. Miss Sanderson sat on a folding chair that had outlived better backs and nodded to herself at the way a day can be good without insisting it is significant. We stayed to lift poles and fold canvas and sweep biscuit into geographies ants would understand. The light looked for somewhere else to be and found it. People went home with weather in their sleeves and an amount of change that made the parish treasurer optimistic for an entire 2 days. We folded the last table. Rachel locked the hall. Diya pocketed the spare hook because it asked her to. Bernard walked us to the lane and didn't speak because sometimes escort is the only correct noun. At home, the red bell waited in its bracket and the wall looked like itself. We hung the cloth bag on the spare hook near the back door, and it behaved like an object that had always been there and might, one day, hold bread. I wrote in my notebook about how the field had learned to carry us without asking for explanation, and how a child had put 2 letters in the right place on a drawing without needing to know why. The ink stayed. The house declined to be impressed, and that was the compliment. Near midnight, the weather finally tried its joke. Rain insisted. The roof replied. The bell moved once in a breeze and made a small sound, the sound of a thing announcing that it could work if asked. I stood in the kitchen and recognized a feeling that used to announce danger and now announced breath. I turned off the light over the sink and left the one in the hall on, because houses like a witness. We slept because sleep is the honest end of honest work. In the morning, we would return the borrowed tray and thank people for competence. We would put the gadget Bernard had bullied us into accepting in a drawer and find an unsuspecting use for it in 6 months. We would pass the mill and count nothing. We would walk by the conservatory and not check the fuse box. We would hear a bell on a bicycle and not turn it into weather. We would say both names to the hallway and neither would need applause. That is how fates earn their name. You carry things. You put them down. You keep what was useful and return what wasn't meant to stay. Chapter 27. Ordinary Weather. We delivered the borrowed tray to Hall, and thanked the head for keeping the poem crooked in exactly the right place. He told us 22 children had spent break practicing the last line with their own punctuation. He said the piano accepted apologies. He said he'd never liked whistles, and was glad Bernard hadn't found a use for his. At practicalities, Mrs. Winstanley stood on a small step stool she didn't need, dusting the top shelf out of sheer principle. "You survived," she said. "So did my sponge. Choose a reward." I asked for twine. She wrapped me a length without fuss and said, "String doesn't solve problems. It encourages them to behave." On the lane, we met the suit without his suit, a jumper that suggested he had learned what laundries do. The small girl with the dinosaur zip tugged him toward the bookstall, even though the fate was gone. Habit is a path children repave daily. He gave us the resigned nod of modestly improved man. He didn't mention files. He didn't mention anything. His daughter said hello to our names, as if trying them on for size, and took both away to see if they fit her own mouth. We passed like weather. The mill wanted nothing from us, and that, too, was a form of welcome. A council van was backed up to the curb. 2 men in high-vis jackets oiling the axle with the unceremonious competence of people who keep towns from becoming museums. Bit of grit, one said to nobody. Bit of rain. Bit of this and that. He asked me to hold a spanner, and I did, and he took it back without thanking me, because the thank you was the offer. We understood each other. The wheel made a gentler sound and kept its arithmetic. The carved circle held only water and light. That was enough. At the bench, the initials looked less like a claim and more like a courtesy. Someone had chalked a map of the fate, as if the field needed reminding where the lemonade had been. The lines blurred under last night's rain and still told the story. Here were the biscuits, here the plants. Here the small bell tied to a pole that had remembered how to be an instruction without becoming an omen. Bernard arrived carrying a paper bag that turned out to hold nothing but air. He'd forgotten what he meant to bring and refused to be embarrassed. "I am practicing," he said, The ancient art of not rescuing a perfectly good day. He sat, approved of the view, and did no more damage than that. We stopped by the conservatory, because plants were being counted. The fuse box door stayed shut. Hewer's sentence did its quiet work in the dark, as if words left alone could learn to be architectural. A boy in an oversized volunteer vest tried to pronounce pelargonum and failed honorably. Diya taught him the trick for G, and then made him teach her in return. He did, solemn as a priest. Home again, we took the odd gadget Bernard had bullied us into accepting, found in a drawer, and promised it a future we didn't owe it. Rachel wrote 2 thank-you notes in the clean, sensible hand that makes stationers feel seen. One to the librarian for her fidelity to crooked titles. One to Miss Sanderson for being the kind of person who writes letters on paper and tapes rosemary to envelopes. Diya wrote a 3rd to nobody, then tore it up, then smiled like someone who has earned her own silence and intends to spend it carefully. After lunch, children's bells piped up in the street. One, then another, then, as if a flock had decided to practice, a few more. Not a chorus, just a handful of small, sane announcements that corners were being rounded and the world might want to be warned without panic. I stood by the window and let the sound pass through. It didn't touch anything it didn't need to. In the afternoon, Miss Sanderson sent a text without punctuation. The poem is attracting arguments about commas, as it should also. The piano forgave us. The woman with the B pen rang to say a parent had come in with an old envelope addressed in my 4 letters and asked if we wanted it. Inside there was nothing but a blank card, probably once meant to be a place for a sentence that had found a better mouth. "I'll keep it until it admits a purpose," she said. We offer sanctuary to undecided paper. We took a walk that refused set pieces. No mill, no conservatory, no shop under its saw cathedral of jars. We crossed the square and let ourselves be undramatic in public. The harbor made its usual arguments. A man mended a net with a patience that reminded me of Mrs. W.'s twine. A gull litigated ownership of a bench and lost. Rachel bought tomatoes from a stall that never remembers our name and never needs to. Diya once again approved of bread in principle and not in practice. Back home, the house wanted the low work of the day. Cups washed, a shirt mended along the tired seam, sweepings gathered in the dustpan that insists on missing the last 2 grains as a matter of personality. I rehung the cloth bag with the red bell stitched on its hem, so its shadow made a small banner on the wall. I wrote in the notebook 3 lines, one about the wheel, one about the boy in the vest, one about the sound a spanner makes in an honest hand, and did not check for vanishing ink. Dusk came without fanfare. Bernard texted weather, manageable. The librarian sent a photograph of a child standing solemnly beside the corridor poem as if providing scale. Hewer did not write, which felt correct. The soup remained a citizen, which felt newly possible. Somewhere in town, a dog with a white patch over one, I put his head on the knee of someone who has always wanted a witness, and then left again, as dogs do when their job is to keep the town moving. We took the red bell down and set it on the table, because it likes to share its attention. Rachel rang at once, the exact note that means dinner is a sentence and not a negotiation. Diya opened the window an inch to let the house trade breath with the lane. We ate, without trying to make the meal improve us. After, we walked to the bench and sat, not to confirm anything, only because the boards have learned our weight and offer back like a favor. "Do you miss the chase?" Rachel asked, not as a doctor, as a woman who knows about nervous systems. "I thought I would," I said. "Turns out I like the part after. The filing that isn't filing. The small correct tools." "Ordinary weather," Diya said. Watching Canal refused to be dramatic. "Ordinary weather," I agreed. On the way home, a boy with a bell he clearly loved almost too much rang it 3 times just to see whether the air would applaud. It didn't. It carried the sound forward to the next corner and left it there for the next set of feet. We passed the conservatory without testing the fuse box. We passed the parish hall without checking for chairs. We passed practicalities after closing and admired the sign in the window, "Closed for counting," which is exactly what the town has been doing and exactly what it should keep doing. Before bed, I stood at the dresser and read my mother's line again. He will answer to both names at home. I touched the glass with 2 fingers, not for ritual, but to remind the paper that it lives in a house. I took the registrar's card out of my wallet and put it back again. Proof traveling from one pocket to another like a memory learning its route. I opened the drawer deliberate and found it as I had left it. Letters behaving, photograph breathing its paper air, consent wearing my correction like a button sewn on by a calmer hand. In the night, wind practiced its scales against the gutter. The bell moved and made a quiet note that didn't need us. The seer rehearsed tomorrow's arithmetic and filed it under tides. I slept with both names within reach, not as guards, only as familiar objects a hand can find in the dark without thinking. In the morning, we would return a book to the library and accept a conversation about commas. We would pass the mill and keep our eyes on the path. We would ring the bell because hands like to check that rope still answer. We would live in ordinary weather and call it what it is, the part of the story that keeps the rest from blowing away. Chapter 28. Line break. School had asked if we would come talk to one class about poems, and about how lines decide where to breathe. We took the long way so the town could rehearse being itself. Practicalities open the way a book opens when a hand that knows it is nearby. Mrs. Winstanley was standing at the threshold, coaxing a hinge into decency with oil and a look that makes metal behave. She waved us through without words. The conservatory kept its ribs and its taped sentence private. The wheel took no attendance. The bench let goals be in charge of indifference. The classroom was as rooms like that are, posters that intend to be permanent and end up being seasonal, a plant that has learned to fake enthusiasm, a whiteboard that can't stop believing in the future the way board markers dream it. The teacher had done the decent thing and moved the desks into a curve, like a small theater that doesn't want to admit it's sentimental. The children were at the age when hands go up too fast and stay up too long, as if arms could manufacture authority. We didn't sit behind the teacher's desk. We sat on the edge of the table the way people sit who haven't forgotten the tax a chair can exact from a room. The teacher introduced us with 3 sentences, and none of them were about suffering. She said we wrote a poem together when we were their size, and that it was not perfect, and that this was the point. She said we were going to talk about where breath goes when it's asked to be honest. I asked the first question, not because I enjoy it, but because rooms like to be taught how to ask. What is a line break for? I said. Hands sprouted. A girl with a pencil behind her ear said, it's where the words go to think. A boy in a jumper with a stain he had already forgiven said, it's where you rest your lungs so the next bit lands. A third child, serious with freckles and ambition, said, it's so the poem doesn't run away. We read our old poem on the board, the font too smooth for the words it was hosting. The last line glowed faintly as if remembering its arguments. We asked them where it should break. They disagreed as if trained by good families. A dozen versions of the same air. Rachel stood by the board and let each version stand for a minute, a small republic of breath. A hand stayed down. Small boy, hair refusing a parting, bell on his backpack because bell is now a fashion. You, I said, because sometimes silence has a good answer. He shrugged and said, it breaks where your face changes. He pointed at me without drama. There, he said, between being and strong. Your mouth does 2 different jobs. Diya laughed the way you laugh when a child has accidentally invented a theory, and we wrote his line on the board and let it be untidy. This is correct, she said. Also the other ones are. A good line break is a room with more than one door. Another hand, this one high with the righteousness of curiosity. What if someone calls you the wrong name? A girl asked. Does the line break there too? I said both names, carefully, into the classroom air that has kept countless sentences. Sometimes, I said, the line breaks there for a while. Sometimes you teach it to break somewhere else. I put a palm on my chest and the other over my mouth. The name you use in here, the chest, and the name you use out here, the mouth, sometimes take turns. If you're lucky, they learn to be the same sentence. "Do you miss the old bell?" a boy asked. "Not our bell. Not the red one. The broken one. The one that has stopped needing to explain itself." "No," I said, and felt the exact rightness of it land. I'm glad it got to retire. I told them the wheel doesn't care about our metaphors, and that this is one of the river's jobs, refusing to be employed beyond its range. "You can keep a tool in your pocket as long as you like," I said. "You can also hang it on a wall and let it be hardware. The trick is knowing when." After, we let them hold the cloth bag Mrs. W. had stitched with the wobbly red bell. They treated it with the respect children have for anything that looks like it might hold sweets later and secrets now. We gave the pairing card to the teacher for a minute, and she read the names without saying them out loud, which is a small, excellent skill. "Thank you," she said, and handed it back like an oath. In the corridor, on our way past the photocopied poem, a boy from another class looked up at us and said, "Are you the wheel people?" He said it like a compliment he wasn't sure we deserved, and then went on with his day, because he had somewhere to be. I liked him for that. Outside, the sky was trying to decide whether to keep from raining for our sake. It did not. We let it. On the square, a man had set up a stall to sharpen knives and exhibit patience. He listened to metal the way some people listen to confession. Rachel watched his hands and decided he was competent enough not to be interesting. Diya bought a second-hand book on punctuation and didn't pretend it wasn't for showing off. We walked a long way as if the town were a sentence we were testing for endurance. On the lane by the mill, a woman in a high-vis vest was painting a thick white line at the edge of the road. She moved like a person accustomed to making boundaries out of liquid. She nodded at us without ceremony. "It was asked for," she said, meaning the line. Sometimes people need to see where the lane forgets to be road. Her breath steamed in the cold in a way that reminded me of tapes and what they used to take from rooms like ours. "You get used to cars," she said, "and then you forgive them less." We left her to it. The wheel went on performing its humility. The carved circle held rain and sky. The bench offered us its boards without comment. We sat. We said nothing. At the houses across the water, a window lifted and a hand shook out a cloth and closed. This is what towns are for, proof of breath in other rooms. At the conservatory, we checked the fuse box despite our vows and found Hewer's sentence still working. No further action. Someone had tucked a small sprig of something green behind the paper. Not ceremony. Habit. Life liking a corner. Afternoon did its small list. Practicality sold a man 2 screws and a story about why it would have been worse. The librarian put tape on the spine of an atlas that refuses to be updated by continents. The parish office stamped something in triplicate, and the woman with the B pen let a teenager keep one of the stamp blanks for practice. We let the day get away with being decent. At home, the wall held its weather of paper and small metal. The red bell sat where it sits. I wrote in my notebook 2 sentences that belonged to today. A line break is where the face changes. A name is where the breath rests before it goes on. I didn't check if the ink would vanish. We are past that now. The page kept what I gave it. The answer phone had recorded Mrs. Carr with a report on her geranium, still alive. No thanks to me. Miss Sanderson with a request for more crooked copies, children like mistakes that behave themselves, and Bernard with a question disguised as a weather note. Wine might try showing off tonight. Want a kettle that owes me a favor. We said yes to the kettle, no to worrying, yes to crooked copies. Evening settled, and the bell did its one small sound when the door breathed. We ate and did not advertise it to our story. On the way to bed, in the mirror, I said both names not to make sure, just because habit can be its own prayer. I thought of the boy in the classroom saying the break goes where your face changes, and found my mouth making 2 small shapes in the space of one breath. In the night, wind tried its show. The roof declined to audition for catastrophe. Somewhere in the town, a bicycle made the right, kind of ringing, and turned left. Somewhere, a dog with a white patch over one. I paused at a corner and chose mercy for a bin. At the back door, the bell shifted and did not ring. A restraint so small I almost missed it. The house slept as if it had been given instructions by a patient God. Morning will come like a sensible teacher. We will take the day in sentences. We will let breath decide where to rest. If someone uses the wrong name, we will forgive their mouth and teach their face. The poem on the wall will keep collecting small arguments about where to break and why. We will keep being the wheel and the water in shifts born of ordinary kindness. And if we pass the mill, and we will not ask for an omen. We will leave the circle to hold sky. We will ring the bell by the back door once before we go out, not to make a point, only to start the line, the one that admits what every page already knows. The breath will go on. Chapter 29. Counterproof. An email from County arrived with human punctuation. They had appended my correction to the digital record and, for the sake of archives that still trust film, added it to the microfiche. They wrote that if I ever needed to review anything older than my patients, I could bring an accompaniment of your choosing. It was bureaucracy learning grammar. We let it be. We walked into a day that didn't require our signatures. At practicalities, Mrs. Winstanley had placed a saucer under a slow drip because there are leaks you don't rush. She slid across the counter a tiny envelope of washers. "For bells you don't own," she said, as if she had already forgiven me for using them on strangers' handlebars. At the square, a man sharpened knives for people who prefer objects to apologize correctly. He looked at Rachel's hands and nodded approval, without needing to know the history of the work they've done. By the library, a boy's bicycle leaned against a low wall, its bell silent because the striker had given up ambition. The boy stared at it the way a person looks at a locked door they know perfectly well is only stuck. I asked permission. He shrugged the brave shrug kids learn before adults teach them to make speeches. I used a coin to coax the top loose, reseated the spring, and pressed the cap until the thread agreed. The note that came out was clean and unshowy. He rang it twice and said thanks in the way towns train you to, by leaving satisfied. The classroom visit had left behind a friendly rumor. A teacher at the other end of the building asked if we might run a short session next week. Lines and breathing, and how to make a poem admit its own air. Diya said yes the way you accept a glass of water when you've done a job that wasn't dramatic and are thirsty anyway. The head gave us a key to the side door no one locks on time. He said, trust, as if it were a noun that could be measured out and returned. We took the long path by the canal. The new white line the road crew had painted shone briefly, like a rule the day respected. The wheel turned. The carved circle held sky. A dog barked twice up near the allotments, and then decided he had done enough. On the bench, the initials softened in damp and still kept their stubborn clarity. I set my hand on the boards as if checking a forehead. The wood was neither fevered nor cold. It was a bench. That felt like progress. Back home, the wall had become what we wanted it to be. Not a shrine, just a sentence made of objects that knew how to stop talking. The poem under its sleeve. The rubbing brown and exact. The bench photograph that had now learned the smell of our kitchen. The small cloth bag with its red stitch bell hanging from the spare hook, like a promise that can afford to be ordinary. In the afternoon, the conservatory side door was propped with a brick dress and moss. We checked the fuse box without opening it. Through the grating we could see Hewer's sentence still taped inside, the paper curling like a leaf prepared to fall in the right season. No further action. Someone, one of the volunteers, probably had tucked a cutting of rosemary behind the clip. It made the small area smell like resolve. By the harbor, Bernard appeared with an empty pocket and a useful silence. We walked as if we had always been walking together and had merely resumed. The station lads say they've sealed the archive shelf and put a note on it. Accompaniment required, he said finally, then added, not for you, for anyone. He squinted at the water, as if looking for a word with fewer edges. Counterproof, he said. That's what printing men call it, when you press a proof to another sheet and take the reverse. Sometimes you see what you missed. Sometimes you just learn there's enough ink. At home, I found a sheet of carbon paper at the back of the desk. The old kind that stains your fingers an honest blue. I slid it beneath a clean page and wrote both names in my plainest hand, the way a person writes at a counter to make a clerk's day easier. Then I lifted the top sheet and looked at the faint mirror lettering left behind. It wasn't beautiful. It was true. I set the counterproof under the glass beside my mother's line. 2 scripts, one faint and one sure, sharing the same pain without asking which counted more. We ate early. Bread took heat and offered itself up without negotiating. Rachel rinsed cups with the economy of someone who has outlived quarrels with crockery. Diya stood at the back door and watched evening sort itself into portions. Tomorrow, she said, let's try a day without checking anything we can't fix. Ambitious, I said. Necessary, she said, and pulled the door in until the red bell's cord trembled and settled. The answer phone held a message from the woman with the B pen. A parent had brought in a misaddressed envelope for our attention, and she would put aside until we decided what attention was. Another from Miss Sanderson. I had become a terror about commas. Send help. Also biscuits. One from the class teacher. The boy with the bell on his backpack had told the room that line breaks happen where faces change, and now half the class wanted mirrors. We sent our yes and our sympathies and our promise of biscuits. After dark to win practice, showing off, and then thought better of it. I opened the drawer one last time, not to test myself, only to include the drawer in the evening, letters in their row. Their weight much closer to paper than the past. Consent wear my line like a note a musician leaves for the next player. The bench photograph holding winter sunlight like a lesson. I put the carbon paper counterproof on top and closed the wood with a palm flat assurance you give good furniture. Before sleep, we walked to the bench and back, because sometimes a body needs to pass familiar edges to learn what it no longer needs to do. The canal hauled its dark quietly. The mill went on being unheroic. At the corner by the school, a teenager rabbit walked a faulty chain back onto its teeth and succeeded without turning it into a parable. That felt like a benediction this town had finally learned how to offer. In the hallway mirror, my mouth made the small change it makes between the one name and the other. There was no drama in it now, only craft. I said both, and then said good night to the glass like a person done with auditions. The red bell moved once in a kind draft and was satisfied not to ring. Morning will come the way useful mornings do. We'll take our key to the side door of a classroom and talk about where breath belongs. We'll show children how a line break can be a question mark you don't have to draw. We'll let them argue about commas because commas are how a day proves it understands mercy. We'll pass the bench and the wheel without asking for weather. We'll leave the conservatory's paper to its work. We'll answer to both names at home and outside it, not because the town has finally learned them, but because we have. And when a bell rings at a corner, it will be exactly what it is. Sound saying I am here, and we will wave it through. That is all a counterproof asks, that we see the second impression and recognize the first without needing to press any harder. Chapter 30. Side door. The classroom had made itself round for us. Desks in a crescent. Chairs had learned not to squeal. A plant on the windowsill pretending the sun was a good teacher. The children took their seats with the solemn hurry of people who are about to be entrusted with a secret and find out it is craft. The teacher stood back, palms open, the way you present a field of weather. We said we'd talk about how poems breathe. I said, and what a line knows that a sentence forgets. Rachel drew a small door on the board, not a rectangle. A door with a handle and a hinge that will forgive mistakes. This is a line break, she said. It opens, it closes, it minds its own business, unless asked. Diya held up a piece of chalk. Your turn, she said to the room. Show us where breath goes when you read what you mean. We wrote a fresh poem together. Not the wheel, not the river. The classroom. A pencil has learned to be useful at both ends. The clock that can't help practicing the future. The door that allows breath in and refuses to imprison it. Children tried line breaks the way you try steps on ice. Some went too far. Some not far enough. A boy raised his hand halfway and kept it there, an honest compromise. "It breaks where I remember," he said. "If I forget, it waits for me." A girl corrected the word spelling with the satisfaction of someone who has found her sport. Another made a comma obey by staring at it until it behaved. A child who hadn't spoken yet drew a tiny bell in a margin, and next to it, 2 initials. He didn't know why. He didn't need to. Habit is a kind of inheritance. Halfway through, a teaching assistant poked her head in with a visitor book that wanted signatures more than attention. I wrote my particular name on the line and let the ink settle. Then I added the other, smaller, like a middle name that knew when to mind the light. The assistant read both and said, "Good," aloud as if confirming a tally. She placed the book on a shelf without turning it into a ceremony. During questions, the boy with the bell on his backpack tugged the strap and made it ring once by accident. The room did not jump. It listened. "How do you stop a line from running away?" he asked. "Give it work," I said. "Lines that have jobs don't bolt." The period bell, not ours, released the room in stages. They left the poem on the board as if they had invented it and were satisfied. The plant on the sill forgot it had pretended the sun. We locked the classroom, left the key where it had agreed to wait, and stepped back into the corridor where our old poem held its crooked dignity against a battalion of laminated rules. Outside, a thin rain had started, the sort that teaches town planners humility. We took the parish path because a woman would be pinned beside an envelope with my 4 letters on it, and the sort of stamp that belongs to last decades. She held it up between 2 fingers as if weighing intention. "Parent brought this in," she said. "No return address. No reason." It felt safer on my desk than in a pocket. We did not open it there. We thanked her the way you thank a fairy for deciding to be punctual. At the library steps we found the suit. Only not that anymore. In a jump of the color of roads, trying not to be wet. His daughter had a book under her arm about a whale that writes letters to the moon. She wanted a membership card, he said, and then caught himself and corrected the sentence the way a man begins to learn how to be particular. "We want a membership card." He knelt to retie a shoe badly and let the child fix it. He looked up at us and didn't apologize for anything, which felt like the correct evolution of his face. At home, we opened the envelope at the table, because tables deserve the chance to turn paper into part of the day. Inside, a single sheet of that old thin stock with the faint blue lines that teach pen's posture. No words. A rubbing graphite patient of the carved circle beneath the wheel, but made a long time ago, before Russ, before our bell sat there, before Sky had learned the shape. The circle on the page was clean, a promise rather than a memory. In the lower corner, 2 initials. Not ours. "E.C. Evelyn," Rachel said. "Or a child sitting near her," Diya said, not to sow intrigue, only to protect accuracy from certainty. She turned the paper and found nothing but the faint buckling a rubbing makes when fingers hesitate and forgive themselves. "It was always going to be there," she said. "We just found our turn." We slid the page under the glass beside my mother's line and the counterproof. The wall had begun to keep its own minutes. It did not ask us to interpret. It asked only to be dusted occasionally and to have the small insects guided gently back out through the window when they mistook paper for weather. We took a long route to the mill because restraint is a muscle and muscles like repetitions. The new white road line shone like a lesson the day felt proud of remembering. At the stone lip the carved circle held a teaspoon of rain and a smudge of sky. The wheel, oiled, made a decent sound and then declined to perform. We did not replace what the river had taken. We let the space do its job. On the bench, someone had left a scarf that would later be claimed without fuss. The initials softened under damp and insisted anyway. We sat and watched a bicyclist check over his shoulder and lift a hand in the small, respectful signal. That means I see you and intend to behave. A dog barked once in a distant garden, and another answered, not as an alarm, just as a disclosure. There are days you want letters. There are days you want no letters. This was neither. It was a day the rubbing had waited for, its turn under glass, its chance to say, without commentary, I was drawn before you arrived, and I will remain after, and you are all right in that sentence. Back home, the answer phone blinked once with an apology from the conservatory. A fuse had misbehaved. A volunteer had corrected it. No one had electrocuted themselves. The plant sale had raised enough to keep the worst of winter out of the cactus house. Miss Sanderson sent a photograph of a small army of children arguing with a teacher about whether a comma could be replaced with a breath. The head teacher asked, politely, if we would consider the corridor poem permanent for the year. We said yes, and then forgot to feel brave about it. Evening did what evenings do when given no instructions. It warmed the room, then left. I made a carbon copy of the new rubbing with the old sheet of blue I'd found, not because it needed a twin, but because the act of pressing a thing to another thing and watching its mirror appear still felt like permission. The counterproof wasn't beautiful. It didn't need to be. We slipped it into the drawer where letters sleep. The drawer closed without making a case for itself. We ate. After, we walked to the school to return the key to the side door and, out of habit, looked up at our poem in the corridor. A custodian polishing the floor paused to let us pass and said, "Good line," as if responding to an argument we had not made. He returned the polish to the corridor, and the corridor accepted. On the way back, the suit and his daughter passed us on a corner where bells are useful. She rang hers twice, not as a warning, as an announcement. He said her name with pride audible in the shape, and then, to my surprise, said mine, the particular one, without practicing first. I said his surname back to him the way men do when they've decided to try being neighbors. At the door, the red bell's cord brushed my wrist like the smallest of liturgies. I rang it. Once, the way you tap a teaspoon against a glass to ask a room to notice it is already together. The sound went to the hallway and took a seat. I wrote a page about the side door in the classroom, and the child who thought line breaks happen where faces change. I added a sentence about the envelope and did not attempt to improve it with theories. The ink remained. The page added its breath to the house. Before sleep, I stood in the mirror and said both names, not as a test, not as a thank you, not as a challenge, as a practice. Somewhere beyond the roofs of Fox made a noise the town has learned to classify as normal. Somewhere a bicycle bell informed a corner of the intention to turn. The seer rehearsed tomorrow and let us borrow a little of its certainty. We left one lamp on, not for safety, for welcome. The bell moved once and chose quiet. The drawer kept its counsel. The wall held its papers. The small, good weather rooms rose and fell with our breath. We slept. Chapter 31. Accompaniment. Evelyn called at 9 with that librarian calm she wears when a day might try to misbehave. If you've got your walking shoes, she said, let's give County the thing it says it wants and see if it knows what to do with it. She didn't explain which thing. She didn't need to. We met on the steps beneath the carved municipal optimism. She looked older in a way I liked. Edges softened not by defeat, but by practice. In her hand, a folder with nothing written on it. Your rubbing, she said, nodding toward the paper under our glass, was made by a child who likes circles better than bells. The initials are mine, because I was given the job of signing everything and decided to teach the habit of ownership. This copy is a twin I kept against the rules. I'm returning twinship to its rightful house. We went down in the lift that enjoys pretending to be useful. The basement smelled of paper that has finally made peace with dust. The archive room opened the way rooms open for people who treat them like colleagues. Evelyn set the folder on the table and did nothing remotely ceremonial with it. They've added a note to your file, she said. Accompaniment required. It is the nicest word we've managed for supervision. Rachel's hands rested on the table, as if listening through wood. Diya kept the sort of stillness that allows other things to move. I took out the counterproof, the faint mirror of my names, and looked at it until the old trick of vanishing ink failed to even try. We don't need to listen, I said, meaning the intake tape in its sleeve on the shelf behind us, obedient as a domesticated danger. No, Evelyn said, "But the room could use a sentence of yours that isn't medical." She pushed a sheet of headed paper across the table, as if we were in the kind of office that believes in the future. Write what you want the file to remember when none of us is here to supervise its manners. I wrote, careful and plain, the way you write when you are addressing both a clerk and a ghost. I wrote that I asked to forget because a child believed forgetting could be a door he could hold shut with his back. I wrote that I asked to remember because a man believed honesty could be a window you leave open just enough. I wrote that anyone who comes to this shelf later should bring their own person and not their recorder. I signed with both names, one as particular, one as historical, and let the ink dry until the word accompaniment looked less like a rule and more like a promise to arrive with witnesses. Evelyn read without editorializing. "Good," she said. "Rooms like this learn slowly. They remember faster when the sentences are short." She slipped the sheet into a new sleeve, annotated a card with dates and initials, and slid the folder home between two boxes that had learned to live together despite their labels. We stood there quietly, an odd little congregation of people who had stopped believing furniture needed absolution. Somewhere in the stack of fan tried, and failed to become a breeze. Evelyn touched the edge of the shelf the way a good caretaker touches a sleeping child's door. "Catherine told me she wrote to you," she said, as if mentioning an umbrella we might recall owning. "She was better than we deserved and worse than she wanted. I keep both truths filed." She wrote, "No further action," in a place that needed the words more than she did. Rachel said, "She should have written them sooner," Diya added, merciless and kind at once. Evelyn's mouth did the small-shaped English women, reserved for grief. They are determined to keep useful. "She tried late," she said. "Late has saved more rooms than I like to admit." We left the basement with the careful relief of divers. Outside, weather had chosen a dignified gray. The town held itself together, without borrowing gravitas from umbrellas. At the library steps we paused, because the habit is valued here. The librarian lifted a palm in greeting, and did not make us sign anything. On the square, the knife sharpener listened to a blade that didn't belong to us, and nodded once when it finished speaking. In the parish window, the be-pen woman had propped a notice that managed to be cheerful about ordinances. The conservatory ribs at the end of the path were a sketch against the cloud, a machine for letting light be itself. We walked to the mill, because the hour was in the mood for old places. The councilmen had gone. The oil's quiet remained. The carved circle held a coin of sky. The dented bell wasn't there, and the circle had stopped looking bereft about it. I set 2 fingers on the stone and felt the precise, unsurprised coolness of objects that know their jobs. A dog barked somewhere up the lane, and then apologized to no one by doing it again, softer. On the bench, the scarf from yesterday had found its owner or a new neck. The initials had become their own weather. We sat close enough for elbows to be pronouns. I thought about ends, which are only line breaks written by calendars. To wheel the wheel goodbye? I asked, because questions left unsaid start pretending to be solutions. "We owe the wheel nothing," Diya said. "We owe the boy a decent exit." "Then let him leave through an ordinary door," Rachel said, and the bench slouched into agreement. We didn't stand immediately. We let the canal count to whatever number canals prefer. Across the water, a woman lifted a sheet and snapped it like a flag of surrender to routine. Behind us, a bicycle bell made a plain, serviceable sound and kept going with the conviction of small machines. Back home, I hung Evelyn's twin rubbing beside its sibling and did not try to decide which had won at permanence. The wall looked like a set of field notes left by a team that had been thorough without becoming tedious. The red bell supervised the arrangement with the calm of a foreman who has discovered delegation. Bernard arrived when the afternoon forgot to pick a side. He brought no envelopes, only a newspaper already folded to the page that contains puzzles and weather. "I'm told," he said, by a person who claims to know, that the county will be revising the manual to include the sentence about accompaniment. They'll pretend they invented it. He looked at the new rubbing and the old and gave them the small nod he awards to jobs finished to normal standards. "You will be asked to speak at something," he added, almost apologetically. "Say yes or say no. The town will continue either way." "We may say no," I said. "The wheel doesn't need our commentary to turn." "Even better," he said, satisfied. After he left, we ate in that unambitious way meals prefer: heat, salt, honesty. Then we took the side door, key back to school, and stood in the corridor while a custodian worked a mop through a stubborn corner, as if coaxing a tide around a headland. The poem looked like it intended to stay. A child passing in socks read the last line under her breath and then, as if try on a hat, tried it again with a different break. I approved her choices in the quiet authority of a man who has run out of appetite for rightness and bought shares in exactness instead. At the conservatory, evening took its color from the glass. We didn't open the fuse box. We could smell rosemary even without proof. On the path, a teenager rode a bicycle properly and did not make eye contact with his good choices, which is how you keep them. The parish office door was locked, and the B-pen was pinned by an elastic band to a stack of forms that had learned patience. Near the harbor, the suit appeared with his daughter and a library card in her hand. He nodded as if human language were a tool he no longer resented using in public. She rang her bell once with the satisfaction of a small citizen. We spoke our hellos like people who have stopped expecting credit. The heir did the comfortable thing of carrying voices to tolerable distances, and then dropping them so quiet could resume. In the lane, at our back door, the red bell's cord brushed my wrist the way it does when the day decides to sign itself. I rang at once because dinner plates like witnesses. The sound took its seat and didn't insist on a speech. On the wall, the two rubbings and the counterproof, and the letter became less like artifacts and more like tools that had been cleaned and put away properly. I wrote in my notebook until my hand told me the body was finished with ink. I wrote that accompaniment is what you call it when you take yourself along. I wrote that endings are where a breath agrees to become ordinary again. Before sleep, I opened the drawer and visited the letters out of courtesy, not compulsion. They behaved, as they do now, like good paper. The consent with my line on the back looked like a document that had learned it was a doorstop. The bench photograph held its light. I closed the drawer and pressed my palm with the way you reassure a horse you don't intend to ride. In the mirror, I said both names once, and neither needed rehearsal. Somewhere the sea performed its accounting, and no one audited. Somewhere a dog with a white patch over one. I made a circuit of streets that did not require his testimony. The bell moved in a fair wind, and was satisfied not to ring. We left a lamp on for the room, not for luck, but for manners. We slept in the ordinary, whether we'd asked for accompaniment enough. Chapter 32. Aftercare. Evelyn called before 10. There's a timbre people have when they've decided to ask you for something that won't injure you. Accompaniment, she said. A girl, 16, wants to see what the room wrote about her. Her mother will come. I'd like you to be a witness who doesn't take notes. What's her name? I asked. Leave space for her to say it, she said. For now, she's a first initial in calendar. Rachel listened while I relayed the plan. Her hands did that stillness surgeons learn when nothing requires them for half a minute. You know how to be furniture without turning into a wall, she said. Take that skill. Diya tied back her hair in the doorway and looked at me with the sort of approval you give a day that might behave if you flattered in advance. Don't bring the bell, she said. Bring your pockets empty so there's room for whatever needs carrying. County had put on its reliable face. Evelyn met us with a lanyard and a patience that made the security guard nod without reading. In the foyer, a girl sat with one knee up, chin resting on the hinge of herself. Her mother's hand lay on a bag, as if weight could be moral. The girl had the watchful eyes of someone who has been grated too many times. She looked at me the way you examine a chair. Will it hold? Is it meant for me? I gave her a name to call me that wasn't either of mine and didn't require allegiance. She nodded once, not yet a treaty. In the archive room, the air did its old sweetness over paper. Evelyn took a tape from a sleeve and placed it on the table without threat. "We don't have to listen," she said. "Listening is a choice. The index card knows your first initial and what month you arrived. It does not know who you are when you breathe." The girl took the card and read it as if testing a tether. "They always spell me with an extra letter," she said, a quiet victory, and placed the card down as if filing a correction. The mother held the edge of the table with 2 fingers, a person who has found the exact amount of surface that steadies. We sat. We stayed. The tape's mouth stayed shut. Evelyn slid across a sheet with the same heading she'd given me yesterday and a pen that had never tasted a form. "If you want the file to remember a sentence that belongs to you," she said, "write it. If you don't want to, we will leave the space blank and invite the room to improve itself later." The girl wrote. She wrote for a long time without the panic rooms induce. When she finished, she pushed the paper to the center, the way you slide a plate you have cooked for people you are not sure you trust with appetite. Evelyn read and nodded without needing to say the word good. The mother read and breathed the way someone breathes when a window in a room finally remembers how. The sentence was plain, which is to say, perfect. "You can keep your copy. I'll keep myself." We did not applaud. We shelved it like bread. Evelyn annotated a card with today, and exactly whom the day had belonged to. I asked the girl whether she wanted to walk a little before leaving the building, the way divers do after surfacing. She nodded, and we took the long corridor lined with maps of the county that remained too large to fit any story. At the back steps, she said her name. She said it once, the way someone tests a word that has been waiting, and then again, not louder, only warmer. I said it back with the right vowel. She judged the accuracy, awarded me competence, and took the second step without looking down. Her mother let go of the bag and let her hands remember themselves. Outside, weather behaved like a public service. We walked to the conservatory, because greenhouses are hospitals that learn how to heal before billing. The fuse box on the wall held Hewer's sentence still, paper now the color tea. The girl read no further action, as if it were newly invented. "Does it work?" she asked. "Off enough," Diya said later, when I told a question, "to be worth teaching the buildings." We took them by the lane, because leaving by the river explains a town, the people who may not stay. The white line on the road did its narrow mercy. The wheel was working and not trying to be art. The carved circle held its coin of sky and last night's weather. The girl did not ask what any of it meant. She looked and remembered and didn't draft an essay in her head. When we reached the bench, she traced the initials with one finger and did not ask whose, as if the world's inventory of your letters is not always a point. Back at County, she took her copy of the sentence Evelyn had filed and folded it without scarring the paper. The mother thanked us with the dignity of someone paying with a currency she refuses to call gratitude. Evelyn shook my hand with the professional intimacy of colleagues and looked, for 1 second, like a woman who had taught a door to open by being kind to its hinge. After, the town rewarded us with unexceptional hunger. Rachel fed it without preaching. I stood at the back door and let the red bell's cord kiss my wrist and not ring. We ate, which is my favorite epilogue. The answer phone held a message from the head teacher that he had caught 2 children moving the poem's comma and had decided to let them take turns being right. Miss Sanderson reported that her shortbread tin had learned the route to our house and might start arriving without courier. Bernard texted a single word, weather, and then forgot to add a question mark. I answered ordinary, and he sent back a small emoji of a cloud that didn't know it was funny. In the afternoon, I took a copy of the girl's sentence, my own hand reproducing it with her permission, and slid it under the glass beside my mother's. It didn't unbalance anything. It made a small duet with "He will answer" to both names at home. Between them, the counterproof looked less like an artifact and more like a rehearsal. The wall had stopped being a museum. It had become a notice board where the town left proof that Breath had signed in. We went to mill at dusk, not because we needed to, but because the day pointed and we complied. At the lip of stone, The circle held nothing useful to Omen. The wheels, too, took a small bite of light and paid it back in sound. A boy on a bicycle signaled with care and passed with his head up, as if learning to trust that corners can carry their own weight. A dog barked once in the distance, the tone not alarm, only schedule. "Do you want to say goodbye?" Rachel asked, and made it not a challenge, but an offer to carry what needed carrying. "I don't think the place minds whether we pronounce anything," I said. "It has its work. We have ours." Diya slipped her hand to the crook of my elbow and stood that way, the posture of whether that is decided to be kind. "Aftercare," she said, almost to herself, "what you do once a room has stopped making decisions about you." On the bench, the initials had taken on the dignity of old handwriting in a book you weren't meant to inherit and did. The scarf had indeed found its neck. Across the water, a woman closed a window without checking whether narrative required it. We sat until sitting no longer felt like a ritual, and then we stood. The path home accepted our feet with the boredom that keeps towns alive. At the back door, I rang the bell once, soft. The sound went nowhere special, and then returned, as most sounds do when a house has learned your measurements. I wrote in my notebook about accompaniment and aftercare and how, in certain rooms, being quiet is not withdrawal but a kind of precision. I added a line addressed to the boy in the chair in a building that still counts the chairs. We bring ourselves along now. That is the whole trick. Later, in the mirror, I said both names as if calling two children in from a garden. They came in without argument. Somewhere the sea moved its sums. Somewhere a bicycle turned left for reasons that did not need witnesses. Somewhere a fuse held. Rosemary perfumed a small dark, and a sentence curled and held and held. We left one light on as manners, not magic. We slept with work done, and nothing to count. Chapter 33. Quiet Register. The parish office rang first. The woman with the be pen asked whether I'd like to tidy the ledger, which is how she talks about giving paper a chance to be less wrong. We walked over because walking is the town's way of granting permission. Behind the glass, she produced a cloth-bound book that had outlived 3 filing systems and refused to be replaced by a database with better manners. She opened to a page that had been turning itself in my direction for years. "There," she said, tapping the line where my 4 letters had faded to the color of old sky. "Particular." On the next line, "Ward Historical." The chosen bracket settled like a cat that had stopped arguing with furniture. Beneath, a margin note Evelyn had clearly coached into existence, accompaniment required for any future handling. "Do we sign?" I asked. "You place the pen," she said. "Let the book do the rest." I placed the pen. Its weight admitted that a signature isn't always handwriting. Sometimes it's simply the act of arriving. She closed the ledger with the care people give to items that understand gravity better than they do. "That's the quiet register," she said. "It doesn't announce anything. It remembers." On the square we ran into the suit without his case, which is to say a man with groceries. His daughter held a card from the library and a lemon like a trophy. "We're learning punctuation," she told Diya, "so Dad doesn't lose track of breath." He took the tease like a person practicing the better kind of embarrassment. We traded hellos that didn't ask to be weighed. At practicalities, Mrs. Winstanley was dictating to a hinge again. She slid a small brass label across the counter, the kind you screw into the edge of a shelf when you intend a name to live there. On it, stamped neat as afternoon, red bell. "Don't hang it," she said. "Store it. Labels behave better when they know they are not in charge." The conservatory opened its ribs to a slice of decent light. We did not look at the fuse box. We knew what the paper said, and so did the wall. A volunteer watered something that can forgive overwatering and hummed to him that had lost its history and kept its tune. On the path, a teenager balanced a tray of seedlings and swore softly at physics. Rachel steadied the far edge with 2 fingers. The tray forgave the world and passed a gate. At the school, the corridor poem had attracted a crowd of commas. Children wrote them in the air with fingertips. The way orchestras keep time for music that hasn't been written down yet. The head teacher asked if we would mind if they kept the piece through winter. The hall remembers better when it has something honest up, he said. Portraits make rooms behave. Poems make rooms breathe. We said yes and refused to be made heroic about it. We took the long lane to mill as if testing whether our feet still knew a path that no longer obliged us. The wheel worked without asking us to admire it. The carved circle held an amount of sky that could be measured in teaspoons. The white road line, new enough to be proud of itself, claimed its edge and then minded it. A dog barked once from an allotment, and the bark fell into the category called schedule. At the bench, the initials kept whatever job benches keep for names. Bernard arrived with newspaper already folded to the puzzle page, and a jammed tart he pretended had been forced on him. I hear the county has learned the word accompaniment, he said, as if reporting on an escaped animal returned to the correct habitat. They've stapled it to a policy. Stapling is progress. Quiet progress, Rachel said. The useful kind, he said, and ate the tart like confession. We sat 3 long minutes without petitioning the water for metaphors. Across the canal, a window opened and a rug took its air and returned inside before Weather made an argument. The bicycle bells that passed us were the ordinary sort. Quick, courteous, unambitious. An older man walked the lane with the dignity of someone who trusts shoes to keep their word. He touched the brim of a hat no one had required him to bring. We nodded back, the civic grammar intact. Home again, the wall accepted the brass label without becoming a shrine. I didn't screw it into anything. I set it on the dresser's edge, undecided on purpose. The red bell remained on its bracket. It didn't need a label to know its work. The answer phone blinked. Evelyn, brief. Your sentence is in. The shelf looks improved. Miss Sanderson, pleased. 2 children asked where a poem breathes when nobody's watching. The librarian, practical. The anthology wants a new staple and a nap. The woman with the B pen, conspiratorial. A blank card has turned up insisting on being saved. We have spared from forms. I wrote in the notebook about the ledger and about how some books behave like old friends who don't hug and therefore tell the truth. I wrote about the pen placed, not signing, and how sometimes the most faithful actions don't leave a visible mark. I wrote the phrase quiet register and put a box round it because my hand enjoys keeping certain nouns company. Afternoon did its decent work. We returned the borrowed puzzle page to Bernard, and he pretended not to have written a rude word in pencil, where a clue had deserved better. Diya answered 3 emails from people who only needed 1 sentence. You can keep your copy. Keep yourself. Rachel mended a cuff with such mercy that the thread forgot it had ever been asked to be strong. A child outside practiced ringing a bell in exact way a room needs. Once, then not again. The sound went to the corner and waited for a decision. It didn't get dramatic. It remained sound. Near evening, Evelyn knocked with a folder thin enough to be kind. We're done, she said. For now, and then again when now ends. She stayed for tea, which is to say we didn't perform gratitude. We poured it. There's talk, she admitted, of someone putting on a panel and asking you to explain how to teach rooms to behave. What will you say? Diya asked, more amused and wary. No, I said, or yes, if they let me bring silence as a guest. Bring the bell, Evelyn said, and smirked at her own mischief. Hang it at the back of the hall, and ring it once at the end. Signal that the rest of the conversation is theirs. We took a walk at the hour when houses practiced their window light. The parish door was shut. The B-pen stood in a jar like a flower that had chosen bureaucracy. The conservatory glowed softly as if proofing a recipe for winter. The mill declined to audition. The bench held its line. We passed without asking for plot. At the back door, the red bell's cord brushed my wrist the way a ledger's ribbon finds the right page. I rang it once, not as call but as receipt. The sound went where sound goes in honest rooms, into corners and over the table and into the stairwell, and then out again with enough left to return if needed. I wrote in the notebook until the light decided it was someone else's turn. I wrote the girl sentence again, copying it the way a town copies itself into new people. You can keep your copy. I'll keep myself. I set the brass label on the page and closed the cover, a small weight persuading paper to lie flatter in sleep. In the mirror, I said both names like a head count for a house that doesn't misplace people anymore. Nothing vanished. Nothing asked for a rehearsal. Outside, a bicycle went by, bell untempted. Far off, the sea made the sound of arithmetic. Old sums doing what sums do. In a lane I couldn't see, a dog with a white patch over one. I chose a route that didn't need witnesses and took it. We left one lamp on because manners are what you practice when the story isn't watching. The bell moved, decided against speech, and approved of itself with a restraint. We slept in the quiet register, where breath is recorded not to be proven later, only to be kept. Chapter 34. Sound check. Afternoon light made ribs of the glass. Chairs faced a low platform that refused to become a stage. On a hook at the back of the room, we hung the red bell where exits live. It looked like itself, which is all I wanted. Before anyone arrived, we did a sound check. The microphone made its small, insecure hum. Rachel said her name into it, as if teaching a comm to the wire. I said both of mine, and the air did nothing dramatic, which is a sound I prefer now. Diya stood at the edge of the platform and counted to 8 the way dancers do when they want the floor to know what is about to happen to it. Good, she said to the room. You remember how? People came as if responding to a rumor of biscuits. Evelyn took a seat 3 in from the aisle, a librarian's position. Bernard stood at the back with the posture of a fire exit. The B-pen rested in a pocket, like a pet with manners. The head teacher arrived carrying a folder that had decided to behave. Miss Sanderson placed her tin where hands could find it without having to deserve it. Hewer sat in the last row next to a window and looked like someone who had chosen a minor key on purpose. The suit came with his daughter and stood by the door long enough for the daughter to decide where she wanted to sit. She chose the front, as children do when questions are heavier than shyness. No moderator. No introductions performed to excess. Evelyn lifted a hand, and the room consented to begin. I said that we would talk a little about rooms and breath, and then stop before the furniture got ideas. I said there would be no recordings, and that anyone who needed accompaniment could borrow ours for the hour. The mic behaved. People breathed in the same time signature for once. Rachel went first, because her voice makes procedures less excited about themselves. She spoke about care as a craft and about the ways buildings learn to copy the people who speak in them most often. She said that sometimes the kindest thing you can do to a room is to bring your own chair. Diya spoke next, not about bravery, which is a word that behaves badly in halls, but about practice, the unheroic repetitions by which names teach mouths to use them honestly. She told the story of the classroom where a boy decided that line breaks happen where your face changes, and everyone in the hall tried not to touch their own mouths. I said that a town can be a file, or it can be a ledger, and that we had decided on a ledger. I said that we had asked for no further action and then chosen on purpose the small actions that keep days from becoming stories about themselves. I said that sometimes you ring a bell only to let a room know it is already together. Questions happen politely. A woman asked how to correct someone who used the wrong name without making the errand longer than it needed to be. You can do it in under a breath, Rachel said and demonstrated. A young man asked what to do with a memory that tells him it will manage him if he lets it. Make it useful or put on a wall, Diya said. Those are the only 2 jobs I trust for stories. The girl who liked the moon asked whether rivers remember us when we're not looking. They remember their banks. I said, if we stood there long enough, we belong to that, which is plenty. Hewer lifted a hand from the back, not to confess, not to collect absolution, only to attend. If you were writing the manual now, she asked, what 3 sentences would you add that we might pretend we invented? Bring your own person, I said. No further action, Rachel said. Accompaniment is not surveillance, Diya said. The hall repeated the last one quietly, as if checking the fit. Bernard didn't ask a question. He cleared his throat exactly once, and the room understood it as a benediction disguised as plumbing. The B-Pen woman asked if she could put a small card by the parish window that read, "Quiet, register available on request." "Yes," I said, and half the room nodded as if signing. Miss Sanderson didn't ask anything. She passed the tin until it was lighter and the air sweeter. We kept it short, like a letter that knows its stamp. At the end, I walked to the back, to the hook with the red bell. I didn't touch the microphone. I lifted the bell and rang it once. Just once. The clean, workmanlike note that announces nothing more mystical than the fact of sound in a room that has learned to keep its own counsel. People did not applaud. They did the thing that is better than applause. They stood up and spoke to one another in ordinary voices. After, the suit came to us with his daughter between. He said nothing about files. He said, "Thank you," like a man practicing exits. The girl held up her library card as if it were a passport. "We've learned commas," she informed me. "Dad knows where to put them so he can breathe." He smiled and survived the statement. Hewer passed us without demanding witness and touched the bell's bracket once. A private ritual offered a public would. Evelyn reclaimed her lanyard from her pocket, as if refusing to let it make her uniform. Bernard folded his newspaper and gave us a page of weather as if that were a poem we'd earned. The B-Pen woman promised a card. The head teacher asked to borrow the sentence about accompaniment for a staff meeting, and we gave it without paperwork. Miss Anderson pressed a napkin into my hand that contained the last shortbread and a note that said good endings look like beginnings with less panic. When people had gone and conservatory had remembered its plants, we walked the long way home. The mill took its offstage bow by simply continuing. The carved circle held a circle of sky. On the bench we didn't sit. We touched wood and kept moving, because sometimes you honor a place by not asking for more. At the parish window, a small card already leaned behind the glass. Bees in the corner. The neat hand of a woman who believes in stamps. "Quiet register available on request." No exclamation marks. Mercy rarely needs them. Home smelled like heat and biscuit and paper that has agreed to stay. The wall took the hour as another sheet it did not need to file. I wrote in my notebook about sound checks and small bells and how the best rooms are the ones that learn to behave when you're not there. I wrote the 3 sentences in the order they had chosen themselves and boxed them until the pencil seemed satisfied. Before bed, I stood at the back door and rang the bell once. Not to signal an ending, only to sign out. The note went down the hallway and turned left and found the stairs and sat. In the mirror, I said both names and got a simple hello back from the glass, which is all a person asks at this hour. Somewhere the sea finished a sum and did not show its working. Somewhere a bicycle took a legal corner, and a dog with a white patch over one. I decided the night had everything under control. We left one lamp on for manners. The bell moved in a small draft and kept its counsel. We slept. Chapter 35. End papers. We had promised ourselves a day without errands that asked to be narrated. That is almost what we managed. Practicalities drew us in the way a well-swept floor does. Mrs. Winstanley wore a cardigan the color of common sense, and a look that persuaded more than one screw to reconsider its life. I set the brass label on the counter. "Not for hanging," I said. "For filing." She opened a drawer that smelled of paraffin and apologies and slid the label into a slot among others. Drawer, shelf, hinge, names that make rooms behave. "Labels," she said, "are end papers. You don't notice them unless the book has forgotten itself." On the square, the knife sharpener listened to steel and returned it improved without turning it into theater. The parish door stood open. The B-Pen blinked in a jar beside a stack of forms I had agreed, for once, to nap. A small card leaned in the window. "Quiet register available on request." It looked like it had always been there. At the conservatory, a volunteer watered rosemary and left the corner by the fuse box smelling like the kind of resolve you bless and don't annotate. We didn't open the door. We didn't need to. Hewer's sentence lived there now the way a beam lives in a roof. The lane to the mill had adopted the white edge line, as if it had been born with it. The wheel turned the way good work turns, steadily, unoffended by witnesses. The carved circle on the stone lip held a coin of sky and last night's math. Nothing mysterious asked to be found. That, too, is a kind of generosity. On the bench, Son had dried the initials just enough to make them act like themselves again. Bernard arrived with a paper bag he had actually remembered to fill, jam tarts in a row, sugared like small victories. He handed us one each and looked down at the canal the way some men look at clocks that have decided to cooperate. "I'm retiring," he said, not as an announcement, as an afterthought. "From the parts of the station that mistake my hands for a policy. I'll keep the parts that require chairs and weather." "Congratulations," Rachel said, and meant it in the tense that blesses both past and future. "You'll hate it for a week," Diya said. "Then you'll remember how to read for indecent stretches." He chewed and considered. "When people ask," he said finally, "I'll tell them a boy put his hand in the spokes, and none of us have improved on the honesty of what happened next." He stood, joints practicing retirement, and touched the bench with 2 fingers, a courtesy learned from better liturgies. "If you need me, I'll be the man who looks like he has time." We walked him as far as the bridge and watched him take a route that had belonged to us once and now belonged to everyone. On the way back, a dog with a white patch over one, I trotted the opposite direction without ceremony. He didn't look at us. He didn't need to. He existed like punctuation that knows its job. At school, the corridor poem had acquired a small child's sticky thumbprint on the title. The head teacher, to his credit, had left it. 2 girls argued amiably under their breath about the location of a comma, as if they had been hired to keep the building ventilated. The custodian nodded to us once and made the floor believe in itself. Home put its hands out, and we put our day into them. The answer phone blinked with ordinary intentions, the librarian insisting she would staple the anthology herself because she didn't trust the machine, the woman with the pen reporting that the blank card had applied for sanctuary and been duly accepted, Evelyn saying only shelf improved. Hewer did not write. She had found the right size of quiet. Diya took the blank card we'd retrieved last week from the parish, rescued paper with faint blue lines, and set it in the middle of the table. "End papers," she said. "Every book deserves good ones. What belongs on it?" I asked. "Not a policy," Rachel said. "Something a house can obey." I wrote what the drawer had already taught me. If found, return to where it's used. Under it, smaller, the sentence the room had learned to say, "No further action." I added both names, not stacked like a compromise, but side by side, the way chairs are placed when people intend to talk until the tea cools. We slid the card under the glass beside my mother's line. The wall did not become heavier. It became flatter in the good way, like paper that has decided to stop curling. I rang the red bell once, a note just sufficient to register that sound had reported for work. Toward evening the suit knocked. No case, no hat, a lemon for the girl's science project in one hand, and discomfort in the other. The girl did the talking. "We found where commas go," she announced, and then conspiratorially, "Dad uses them now when he says sorry." He let the joke happen to his face and survived. He asked, almost shyly, if the corridor poem was allowed to stay. "It's teaching me where my breath rests," he said. We told him the head had signed a year's lease, and that the hall was good at honoring leases. He left with the lemon, and a shortbread Miss Sanderson had booby-trapped us into distributing. Night came openly. The sea spoke its long vowel. Bicycle bells practiced civility at corners that used to make my bones bristle. In the kitchen we ate without making philosophy out of bread and heat. After, I took the brass label from my pocket, not the one we'd filed. Another Mrs. W. had slipped in like contraband and set on the dresser. I did not screw it to wood. I let it be a word that had not yet picked a home. I wrote to the boy in the chair, because every book deserves an end paper that addresses the person who opens it first. You were right about doors and wrong about weather. I wrote, "Thank you for guarding what you could. I am taking the watch." There is bread. There are people. The bell rings when asked and then stops. You can rest. Rachel read it and put her hand flat on the page. The way you calm a skittish animal. Diya stood at the back door and moved the cord with one finger. So the bell made the smallest sound a bell can make and still be a bell. One more day, she said, not as a threat or a promise, just as inventory. We walked to the bench, because habit is a bridge to sleep. The initials kept their patient brightness. The carved circle at the mill accepted starlight, without turning it into myth. The parish window held its card. The conservatory ribs had a gloss you only see when a town has remembered its plants. Bernard, 2 streets over, turned off a lamp and became a man who was time. Somewhere a dog with a white patch over one, I chose a corner and let it be enough. Back at the house, I said both names in the hallway, softer than usual, like a rehearsal for a curtain call that doesn't require bows. The glass on the dresser reflected nothing heroic. Only a room willing to keep what it has and return the rest. I left the notebook open with the end paper letter on top, not to tempt vanishing ink. Those days have admitted defeat. But to invite dawn to arrive to a desk that has learned its job. We turned off the kitchen light and left the hall lamp on, because houses have their own courage, but like witnesses. The bell moved in the good draft and chose silence. We slept. In the morning the town would still be the town. We would wake the way books wake, when a hand opens them gently. End papers first, then the first visible sentence of whatever comes after. Chapter 36. First sentence. We were meant to have no business with the town today. We failed politely. Practicalities had the door propped with a paint tin and a promise. Mrs. Winstanley stood on her step stool, sentencing a top shelf to good behavior. She nodded at the bell label in my hand and at my empty pocket, which is to say she approved of the order of things. You'll want string, she said, and cut a length without asking for a story to tie it to. Outside, the square rehearsed being ordinary and succeeded. We stopped at the parish office because the window asked to be admired. The card sat in its corner. Quiet register available on request. Be saluting like punctuation with manners. Inside, the woman with the B pen stamped something no one would ever examine, and looked satisfied on principle. We are keeping a place for paper that breathes, she said, as if reporting weather. At the conservatory, glass ribs made light behave like a promise fulfilled. No one opened the fuse box. Rosemary had taught the corner its scent. Hewer's sentence worked behind the door as a beam works, unnoticed and load-bearing. A volunteer whistled wrong notes with conviction. The plants forgave her. We walked the lane to the mill out of gratitude rather than need. The new road line had taken the curve into muscle. The wheel sound was the sound of a thing that has agreed to be useful. On the stone lip, the carved circle held a coin of sky and a grain of last night's weather. I touched the stone the way you touch a sleeping dog you trust not to startle. Palm down, meaning nothing more complicated than presence. A car chose the long way. A bird made an unambitious note and declined to perform it again. On the bench, the initials had dried into their patient certainty. We sat. Across the canal, a sheet lifted and fell back onto a bed, like a small white, see finding at harbor. A boy signaled before turning, then turned, and the act felt like the town practicing punctuation. A dog with a white patch over one. I trotted past with the cheerful bureaucracy of the citizen at large. He did not check our faces for old stories. He did not owe us that. Do you want a last line? Rachel asked, not as a test, as a kindness. I think I want a first one, I said. We watched the water count to a number only it cares about. Bernard came as far as the bridge and raised a hand that meant nothing dramatic and covered a great deal. He has begun to look like a man with time. The town suits him that way. He pointed his chin at the wheel at the bench, at us, placing all 3 on the same list without bothering to write any of it down. At school, our crooked poem in the corridor had found a way to look inevitable. 2 children stood under it and argued about where a breath belongs, then traded places, and tried it the other way and discovered they could both be right. The head teacher passed with a staple gun he didn't trust and promised not to use. The custodian's mop persuaded the floor to believe in shine. We left by the side door. The key waited on its hook like a word that knows when to stay. On the square, the suit carried groceries and a library book with a whale on the cover. His daughter held a lemon like a moon and rang her bell once to announce a corner in the proper way. He said my particular name without rehearsal. I said his surname back with the cautious affection of neighbors. No one checked the air for witnesses. Home at an hour that houses prefer. We made lunch from heat and honesty. The answer phone had nothing urgent to propose. Miss Sanderson delivered shortbread invisibly, the way birds deliver seed to places that can be trusted with it. Evelyn's note said only, "Shelf improved again. You've taught it to breathe." Hewer didn't write. That was the gift. Afternoon found us where afternoons go. I took the brass label and the string and did nothing with either. We hung the cloth bag by the door, the one with the red bell stitched clumsily at its hem. It made a small banner shadow on the wall. The counterproof lay under glass like a second voice that had learned harmony. The blank card we had filled, if found, returned to where it's used. No further action. Behave like a rule a house could obey without drama. We walked once more to places that had adopted us without promises. At the conservatory, the volunteer had finished watering and left the corner to smell like a plan. At the parish door, the bee pen leaned in its jar like a tool at rest. At practicalities, Mrs. Winstanley flipped a sign to close for counting and waved us away as if granting a pardon for crimes we were not about to commit. I liked her for that. We did not go to county. The basement did not audition. Somewhere a tape the color of certain kinds of danger lay still and behaved like plastic rather than weather. Somewhere a ledger slept, content with its last tidy entry. Somewhere a shelf remembered our sentence and did not demand footnotes. Evening learned the room. The C pronounced its long vowel. Bicycle bells stitched corners together with civility. We ate. We cleared. We left warm plates drying because plates, given time, prefer to do that work themselves. In the lane, voices traded errands without turning them into plot. A fox edited a bin and accepted the editor's corrections. I wrote the first sentence I had been holding off writing, the one that belongs to after "I live here." I wrote it once in ink and once, lighter, in pencil, because some truths deserve a rehearsal they will not need. I wrote both names beneath it, not to rank them, only to acknowledge their labor. I closed the notebook without waiting to see if any part of it wanted to vanish. It didn't. Those days have admitted defeat. We took the long, warm route to the bench one more time, not to bless it, not to be blessed by it, only to give the boards a courtesy of knowing our weight. We stood at the mill and did not extract meaning. We passed the conservatory and did not open the door that keeps the sentence safe. We looked in at the parish card and let the bees keep their corner. We passed the square and did not correct anyone's route. At the back door, the red bell's cord found my wrist, the smallest liturgy. I rang it once, then once again, not as an omen or a thesis, only to mark the hour and to tell the hallway what it already knew. The room is together. The note went into corners and sat. It did not petition for translation. In the mirror, I said both names like a roll call for a class that has learned to answer without fear being sent out. They came back unhurried. They did not compete. They sounded like tools ready to be used, and then put away properly. Rachel stood by the dresser and read my mother's line aloud, not solemnly, only accurately. "He will answer to both names at home." "He does," she said, and closed the glass with her palm. Diya stood by the door and moved the cord until the bell made that near-silent sound that is still a sound, then let it rest. We left one lamp on, because houses like to be believed in after dark. Somewhere a dog with a white patch over one. I chose his route by smell and schedule. Somewhere a bicycle took the right corner at the right speed. Somewhere in a corridor, 2 children adjusted a comma and learned more than grammar. Somewhere a shelf in the basement kept its sentence, and a room upstairs remembered how to breathe. I lay down with the notebook on the table and the bell at its bracket, and the town outside doing its decent work. I did not count backward. I did not ask the dark for instruction. The first sentence was written and the book knew it. Morning would come, as it does, end papers first. We would open the door, and the day would accept us on our own terms. The bell would ring if asked and then stop. The river would keep its arithmetic. The wheel would turn. The bench would hold. I live here. Epilogue, quiet work. There are days the town forgets to be significant and becomes exactly what it promised on paper. The red bell by the back door minds its post as if hired on a permanent, modest contract. The brass label lies on the dresser's edge, undecided and therefore honest. I say both names to the hallway less often now, not because I've grown careless, but because the house has learned them first. Practicalities opens at 10. Mrs. Winstanley keeps a shallow drawer for the small mercies we forget to name. String, labels, washers for bells we don't own. I fix what can be fixed and decline the dignity of charge. Nearby, the parish window keeps its card. Quiet register available on request. Inside, paper is patient. The mill turns as if grateful someone bothered to oil it. The new white line along the lane has already faded to a tone that belongs to here. Underwater, the river files everything, not as evidence, just as texture. When I touch the stone, I no longer translate the feeling into sentences. The skin knows its work. The bench holds. The initials learn to belong to the wood the way old ink claims paper. Other people sit there and do not owe us their reasons. A boy eats chips with a patience he did not have last year. Bells announce nothing grand and are believed. The characters of the town move through their ordinary days. Bernard retires the parts of his job that mistook his hands for policy, pointing at the wheel with a simple, "as you can see." The suit has become a neighbor. He uses commas now when he says sorry, which means his apologies breathe. Miss Sanderson writes her letters on paper and leaves us with the old teacher's grace. Good work. Keep arguing. Rachel keeps the quiet medicine of ordinary rooms. She rings the red bell once to call me to dinner, and not to meaning. She leaves one light on for manners. With her, my hands remember their better jobs. With her, the house forgets how to scare. As for me, the desk has learned that a notebook is not a crisis. I write the simple inventory a morning prefers. Kettle, light, the small authority of a door that opens and closes on command. I have stopped checking for vanishing ink. Those days are conceded. Sometimes someone stops me on the square to ask whether the river remembers them. I tell them the same answer the water gave me. It remembers its banks. Stand there long enough, and you belong to that. It is more than enough. When we leave the house, we touch the core of the red bell the way people touch would before making a promise they intend to keep. When we return, I say both names without rehearsal, and the house answers as houses answer when they have stopped being supervisors and remembered how to be hosts. A book ends with what is taught a hand to expect next. We close ours, and the room refuses drama. End papers, then the quiet of the shelf. In the morning, the door opens. The town reports for work. The river takes attendance. The wheel turns. The bench holds. The bell rings if asked and then stops. I live here, which is to say, the first sentence continues doing its small, exact job. This was the fourth part of the novel series of Forgotten Name. Thank you for listening. I remind you that new audiobooks are published weekly on the Inktail channel, both full audiobooks and series. Therefore, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoyed it, you can also support the channel and the author. Check the description. You will find all the info. Thank you, and see you next time.